Let's switch gears now and I guess talk a little bit more about gender. Yeah, we've pointed out on this show before, but seemingly everything from duct tape to handguns seems to be like narrowly gendered. What's the motivation, you suppose, for this level of like polarization?
Well, it's to sell chocolate bars, you see.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was following the Yorkie debate that was happening earlier today on Twitter because, again, I am perpetually on Twitter.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I don't know. Arden, what do you think? Is it purely the result of like a capitalism-based society that needs strict binaries in order to market their products?
I mean, I think that's a big part of it when it comes to things like handguns and like, pink pens, and makeup for men and all these kind of weird things. I think that really does come down to, it's a lot easier for capitalists to market towards a narrower margin of people. But, I think we even see that just in our like culture generally. I think maybe I'm a little biased because of the communities I interact with, but I suspect that has something to do with the impact that evangelical Christianity has on our culture. But, I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I suspect it has at least a moderating factor in the equation.
No question in my mind. I mean, I was raised by a conspiracy theory-minded evangelical preacher who refused to shop at certain toy stores because of news stories about them removing the boy toy section and the girl toy section signs in order to just have a toy store. Just in case some boy might wander into the Barbie aisle and it not be clearly marked. And that we might all fall into some, liberal, hippie, queer conspiracy. I mean,
I'm sorry. I'm just picturing like security tackling a 5-year-old who wandered into the wrong aisle.
I mean, my experience may not be entirely typical, but I know I'm not the only one because that's not some article. That's not some like, wild thing that happened on the internet. I mean, that was daily life for me and my family growing up, having a list of different stores that we weren't allowed to buy things from because they were trying to support this idea that kids are fucking kids and that they can play with any goddamn toy that's appropriate for their age.
Yeah, I think too, we see this kind of thing, and I saw this with my father growing up. He tried to get me to play every sport. He wanted me to hunt. He wanted me to do outdoor stuff. He wanted me to do all the boy things. And, you hear it from conservative commentators like Ben Shapiro, like, oh, well, men are this way in society because they weren't taught how to be boys. And it's just, I think it's so funny because they just really have no clue that these things are innate. Like, I can guarantee you, my father tried really hard to make me a boy. He tried so hard and it didn't work. I mean, I think, I don't know. I think the solution is just going to be a cultural change, but how we get there, that's generations of discourse like this. So.
Well, it's interesting to me that so much of the discourse around the idea of either, oh, well, people of this gender are like this because they weren't trained, or, people of this gender are only like this because they were, trained to be so by, predator type people or whatever. Like this concept of kids being blank slates that can be basically indoctrinated is so fundamental to evangelical society and like fundamentalism. Sure. and religion, this idea that, oh, I was told as a kid, I'm a blank piece of paper. Like that was a line that was told to me multiple times. You are a clean, white, pure sheet of paper, and everything that you do is either the result of someone teaching you well or the result of someone contaminating you. And so I had no autonomy. I had no mind of my own. I had no identity outside of what was put on top of me. And the fact that we're talking about gender in this way is, regardless of why it has perpetuated so deeply in this culture, the fact that we are able to have this conversation in this cadence is specifically because of an evangelical undercurrent, I suppose, in America.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question in my mind, and the reality is the question of, are human beings like a tabula rasa, a blank slate, or are they built on their genetics? That question will never be answered because it creates a false dichotomy. And yet, I cannot tell you in my undergraduate studies in psychology how many professors I had that thought it was just a brilliant idea to propose that question. And the answer that they were, of course, trying to get us to say is that, well, it's a combination of factors. Your environment interacts with your genetics in these complex ways. But I mean, that question is so foundational to the study of psychology, a science that has existed over 100 years at this stage. And the fact that evangelicals are still pushing for notions of conversion therapy and these related ideas that if you played enough football or shot enough deers as a kid, that, you know, the gay or the trans or the whatever could be beaten out of you, is just laughable on its face. And yet it's so strongly clung to because it's vital to the scriptural worldview.
Yeah. One of the things that I remember talking about with a family member, specifically around being trans, I had not yet come out, but I was, very invested in these conversations for some inexplicable reason. I was talking with my family member about this, and they were like, well, I don't like it because of X, or I don't like it because of this scientific study. And ultimately I got them to admit that, like, even if the science did back this up, which, spoiler alert, it does, they would not accept it. And finally I was like, okay, thank you. Now why? Like, now can we get to the reason why? And the concern was procreation. The concern was that, well, how would everybody have kids if the gender virus caught on and like everybody turned trans overnight? Like, how would kids happen? I'm like, pretty much the same, actually. Like, there is probably very little. There will be probably a slight dip in like the number of birth rates, but not very much. But again, the lack of imagination in these circles around, oh, well, you can only have kids if you're a man and a woman in a monogamous relationship that's been blessed by God, by a priest, in a chapel in front of your family, and then you have sex 3 times to have your 3 kids. And then, like, if you're thinking like that is the only way to have kids, of course you're going to be confused about, like, well, what happens when there are different genders and stuff like that. But ultimately, the concern that I've come across the most is procreation. And I'm just going to tell you straight up, that's a shit excuse. Like, that's a shit reason. So find another one, because it's bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I found out that I was actually unable to have kids of my own, like, biologically, when I was super young. And that never once was like a relevant factor for me. I can't wait to be a mother. I'm so excited, not in the near future, but one day. And I can't wait to, like, adopt kids. I worked in behavioral health for a long time. I worked with kids who were in the system. And there are so many kids who need a home of loving parents. This notion that you have to create a kid is just particularly so strange. Like, especially coming from the people who try to fight for, oh, well, if you can't have the kid, or if you don't want to take care of the kid, put it up for adoption or something, just don't get an abortion. And it's like, well, but you also don't want people to adopt kids because you want us all to have them biologically. Right. So, like, there are these it's so typical of these kind of worldviews because they're not founded on, anything real in reality. So there's bound to be areas where their own ideologies conflict internally.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like they didn't think this all the way through. I don't want to put any like claims out there, but I suspect that there was a lack of thought put into these topics. Christy, you're muted.
Yep, my mistake. Yeah, I mean, we can follow these rabbit trails so deeply and start to talk about, like, does our planet really need us to be procreating at these rates? And, how do particularly evangelicals look at adoption, and how do they, is it a form of charity, and look at the history of effectively stealing babies from other countries? I mean, there is a lot to unpack here, and it's a really, really loaded and pretty uncomfortable subject when we start getting into this idea of procreation. But ultimately, it feels like that's just a really casual excuse for so much of this. Like, it avoids the actual conversation around who we are as individuals, around, what our bodies actually mean and what they look like, because we wouldn't be having these same conversations if people who were infertile or in some other way unable to procreate were wanting to pursue relationships or changes to their identity.
Exactly. Yeah. A big component, I even saw some people point out as like, oh, well, one of the reasons super streets say that they don't like trans people is because of, they can't have kids with them. And I'm like, that's okay, but like, that's not... No.
Yeah, like, how true is that? I mean, there's so many.
Let's talk about Venn diagrams for a moment, shall we? Yeah, it's not. Yeah, no. Just no.
Right. It's like, it almost like it suggests that, like, not only do they have this like super sense organ for when someone is trans, but they also have a super sense organ for their attraction for when someone is like fertile.
I'm just thinking of Stephen Molyneux talking about Taylor Swift's eggs at this point, and this is going uncomfortable places in my brain. For anybody who didn't know that happened, I'm sorry. I feel like I violated all of you.
I haven't thought about him since he got booted off of YouTube.
I'm sorry, Stephen who?
Well, we spoke to a caller a little bit earlier about this idea of your gender being, I guess maybe, like, especially as you transition your gender, leaning more into stereotypes than into like a more fully fleshed out idea of gender. And, if all three of us sort of embody this idea to be at least a little bit, have a little bit of ish and squish in your cisness, I'm really curious to hear from the two of y'all what your gender journey has looked like in response to all of that.
Oof, that's a big question. I mean,
you have 3 minutes. Go.
I think it's important to recognize too that, like, there probably are a lot of trans people who conform to certain stereotypes about gender and such, but it's like, when I was talking earlier about, gender also having an interpersonal component, I think a reason that a lot of trans people conform to stereotypes is maybe not necessarily because that they feel like that expresses their gender the best, but because that is what gets society to read them the way that they know themselves to be.
Yeah.
I know
that's
that
a really fair point.
Yeah, I definitely am a binary trans woman, but I definitely think there's probably a certain level of, performative expression that I engage in to ensure that people don't gender me incorrectly, because I know I personally have a very, very strong dysphoria reaction to being misgendered. So that's really important for me to not have that happen. But at the same time, I think those things become so intertwined, it's really hard to separate them out. And if it's okay for a cis person to express their gender in a stereotypical way, why are we criticizing trans people for expressing their gender in a stereotypical normative way? That seems like it's just...
That's a good point. Yeah. I think for me it's very similar. I think you hit on something that really spoke to me, which is I tend to be more okay. And I'll use an analogy, if you will humor me for a moment. So I try to explain to people why I am more okay with slip-ups that call me he, him, or some kind of more masculine identifiers as opposed to feminine ones, even though I am not either, right? Like I don't want to be he, him either. I am they, them, but he, him will get a much less reaction than she, her will. And for me, I try and explain it like this. Pretend your entire life, from when you were a little kid, your parents were like, you're going to play the piano and you're going to be amazing at it, right? You're just going to be an amazing piano player. So we're going to get you all the books. We're going to get you tutors. We're going to get you the instrument. And you practice and you practice and you practice. And you become a really good piano player. And people acknowledge that, and people are like, oh, you're such a good piano player. And you're like, oh, thank you. Like, I practiced a lot. That means a lot. But deep down, you really also want to play the trumpet. And you also really want to be known as a great trumpet player. And so you go out and you buy a trumpet, and your parents are like, why the fuck are you buying a trumpet? You're a piano player. And you're like, I know, but also I want to play the trumpet. So you go, you practice, and it's blood, sweat, and tears, right? And you go to auditions, and they only ever pick you to play piano. And they never, ever mention your trumpet playing. And then when you play trumpet really well, they're like, well, that was fine, I guess. But like, why did you give up the piano? You're like, I didn't. I just also do this thing. And so when someone comes up to you and then they're like, oh, you play the trumpet really well. All of a sudden, even though you're not just a trumpet player, you feel that validation because they're seeing something that everybody else didn't. And they're not holding you to who you used to be or asking you why you changed. So in that same way, I present masculine more comfortably and more aggressively because of the two. It makes me feel a little bit better. But it also is uncomfortable to embody those masculine stereotypes, right? I don't want to do that either, but it's a cost-benefit analysis. And ultimately, it feels a little bit better when people accept me for this oversimplification of a gender than when they accept me for another oversimplification of a gender. If that makes any sense at all. I feel like I rambled for a good bit of that.
No, I'm tracking. I think that's a really beautiful way of proposing it. I guess it just still leaves the question for us and really for our audience of how you navigate this, whether you are cis or trans or somewhere else along that line. How do you choose your gender without being pulled into the gravity well of like toxicity on either side of the spectrum?
Okay, that's an interesting. I wasn't expecting it to necessarily go that way, but I'm going to steal an analogy from Katie that she did on a transatlantic last Saturday, which is, I think, a fantastic way to really identify how you're feeling about your gender, which is a hypothetical scenario where you can imagine if this magical wizard shows up before you, right, and says, I'm going to give you an option. If you want right now, I can magically transform you and nothing else about your life will change. Same relationships, same everything else about your life. But I could magically right now flip a switch and you would be a different gender. Like, would you want that? And I think that is such a powerful like analogy because when you're feeling like you're trans, it's really easy to slip into doubt because it's such an abstract thing that you think like, how could I possibly know if I don't feel like the gender I was assigned at birth, or if I feel like another one even. And I think this is such a great analogy because a lot of the time, the thing that stops you from, finding your expression is this fear that it won't be accepted or that you won't, do it sufficiently to your own satisfaction. But I think if you had that option that you could magically flip the switch and you would say yes, I think that's a pretty strong indicator that, your gender is probably not cis, maybe worth exploring a little more with a little more introspection.
I sense 5 or 6 different people felt very called out just now.
Good.
Oh no.
I did not know that about myself.
That is a really good way to put that. I think that's yeah, it's less of I want to be a trans person, right? And more about I want to be a different gender and that makes me a trans person. Like it's a descriptor by itself, right? It by itself is not a gender, right? When you say what's their gender? Oh, well, they're trans. That doesn't tell me what their gender is. Like that, no, that's not helpful. It's a description of your gender experience and your gender reality. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And also, yes, we are definitely going to show you where to find this transatlantic call-in show, which is amazing. And I'm going to plug relentlessly in the hopes that I get a guest appearance.
Absolutely.
Well, have y'all noticed any of that type of like black and white or that extremism in your own thinking? Anything that has maybe gotten you into trouble? You know, I don't have a concern around the aggressively dressing masculinely, but I do worry oftentimes about really trans and cis folks buying into this idea of like aggressive machismo or of these other forms of femininity that are wrapped up in subservientness, or even if you're avoiding the negative stereotypes, if you're just taking a feminine or masculine aspect of your identity and making that the whole identity and making that everything about who you are, it really cuts off pieces of ourselves. And I wonder how good any of us are at noticing those types of thought processes in ourselves.
Yeah, I think two of the like both sides of that. For me, I only recently, and I feel weird having only recently discovered this, but the concept of trans misogyny specifically, it feels very much like a symptom of this very black and white, stereotypical, toxic way of looking at gender, right? And it's a very specific form of bias towards trans women and femme presenting non-binary AMAB people who actually take on a whole bunch, not just of that normal, quote unquote, normal amount of bigotry that you experience as a trans person, but also taking on that misogyny as well, and what society tells you about choosing to be more feminine and how that's somehow not it's this weird double just whammy of grossness. And on the other side of that, trans men and trans masculine people do tend to be infantilized, right? There's this idea that, oh, if you want to be more masculine, that means you weren't ready to be a woman, or you weren't okay, you never grew up into a woman. And that's something I deal with all the time, is that infantilization of like, this person clearly isn't an adult yet because they haven't figured themselves out and they're not embracing this expectation of what they should be. So on both sides, I mean, even within the LGBTQ plus community, there is a lot of that. So this is something that is still a very real issue that we need to be talking about in every community.
Sure.
Yeah, I think you see also in the trans community, just like you'll see in like evangelical communities of cis women who might internalize certain misogynistic messages and kind of start to fight for them. You have people like the transformed wife, for example, who has said some pretty atrocious things in the online space. You see a lot of trans people falling into, and I'm going to call myself out here, of maybe in their insecurity getting into what might be called like a trans mad or a true scum kind of way of thinking. I definitely can tell you for a chunk of my early transition, I probably would fall into that camp. And I think that comes from, this insecurity of being like, oh, well, I'm not going to be accepted, so I should try to perform femininity in cisnormative culture to such a standard that I become one of the good ones. You see this with people like Blair White, who will bash any non-heteronormative queer person, who will endlessly capitulate to conservative people who are calling her a pedophile to her face. It's really sad. And, I think it's definitely conversations like these that I think that kind of open the door for people to consider, what messages am I holding on to about myself and my gender expression and how I see myself, and how does that reflect how I think about others and the world around me. But it just like religion, in a sense, it's something that's slow and takes time to undo and is really deeply woven into often trauma. So, it's a sensitive journey to untie those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I notice in myself when I am kind of getting lost in these things, or getting too connected to these identities and gravitating to one extreme or another, that I get really uncomfortable with my gender presentation if it isn't like perfectly spot on. This idea that, okay, well, if I'm going to meet somebody, I have to make sure my nail's done or whatever else. That being said, I'm curious if there are any other places where you notice this in yourself, or any tips, I guess, on how to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, if you can arrange to be stuck in your house for a year without any social contact.
Yeah, that goes a long way, sure.
Like, I feel like, honestly, the number of people on Twitter, the number of eggs that have hatched over this last year of not having to conform to gender expectations and having that space and that time relentlessly in front of you to like think about yourself. Honestly, it has been, I probably came leaps and bounds, years and years faster to my own conclusions about myself because of this last year. And don't get me wrong, this last year was horrible in multiple ways. And I'm not being like, oh, well, #blessed. But on the bright side, like if we are looking for silver linings here, the fact that so many people got that space away from those expectations to just grow and flourish and figure things out for themselves, and hopefully bring that out into the world and actually really change the way we view standards of beauty, standards of equality, all of this. I think we're going to see the ripple effects of this for a very long time.
Yeah, that's certainly true. The studies that are going to come out of this period in our culture are going to be devastating and fascinating. And
they thought they were getting a baby boom.
Yeah.
They got a different kind of baby boom. All the baby transes. I love it.
Yeah, well, fun conversation tonight. I really appreciate y'all joining me for all of this, and I guess just serving to highlight this need to select and choose all of our orientations on all of these different spectrums, and to, I guess, be mindful about some of the extremes. I'm going to ask V to kind of walk us through the outro of the show and all of those sorts of pieces. But before we jump into that, any kind of final thoughts or anything, any last impressions you want to make sure to leave with the audience tonight?
Christy, I think you said something earlier that I really liked, of this kind of notion that remembering that we are all just kind of an ascended ape, that like, these labels and stuff are definitely important for discussing these things and for understanding like where oppression lies and being able to like talk about that. But it's also important to remember that we are not these special creatures. We're just existing. There's no like, super magical gender box that we all fit into. Like, we're just animals walking around on the planet. And, I think we can sometimes feel almost compelled by all of these different options to feel like you have to force yourself to fit into a box. But like, I think the message we're really trying to get at here is that like, that's important. If that's important for you, that's important for you. And that's great. And that's totally valid. But at the end of the day, just exist. You're allowed to just exist. And that's, as yourself, and that's totally valid. Like, whether or not you are performing womanhood right, if you are a woman, you're a woman. Whether you are, super straight, or whether you're attracted to trans women or not, like, just, I think we just need to learn to not put so much pressure on ourselves about these things, and to just let ourselves exist in the world and not feel so confined by these abstract ideas.
Yep.
Fair to say. My
last thought is that I have been drinking a gigantic stein of green liquid this entire
it comes
time.
In pints?
And I love you. And nobody has mentioned it. I'm ashamed of all of you.